Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC lower bracket season finals round 1 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into this. We are going to know our final 2 teams that are going to qualify for an international best of 5 series in this video. Of course, not both of these teams will qualify for Worlds. One of them will have to do that through the Worlds qualifying series against North America, but they will at the very least have an opportunity to qualify for Worlds in an international best of 5, while the other 2 teams that end up losing today are going to have their 2023 season officially cut short. So very big stakes. We talked about a couple of these teams a couple of days ago in the upper bracket round number 1. Of course, you can check that video up in the iCard right now. But today, we're going to be covering the 2 lower bracket series to see which of those 2 teams are going to be moving forward. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of these 2 series here today. Did you expect the 2 teams that ended up winning to be the 2 teams that won? Or did you maybe think it was going to go in a different direction? Would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on basically everything going on in the LEC right now down in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in this series, and then at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything up in a nice little bow at the end. Of course, we'll preview both the winners finals and that 3rd, 4th place game, that Worlds qualifying game, if you will. Later on at the end of the video, we're going to go ahead and talk about what I think might happen in those series, give some predictions, but most of this video is going to be spent on the 2 series that we got in the lower bracket round number 1. So let's go ahead and jump right into the analysis. 2 interesting series. We're going to start it off with the one that I think was a little bit more obvious, at the very least on paper. Obviously, anything can happen, specifically in the LEC, which has been very volatile this year. But of course, I'm talking about a matchup between the number 3 seeded Team BDS and the number 6 seeded SK Gaming, the highest, I guess, seed in the lower bracket and the lowest seed in the lower bracket right now, or in the entire tournament, quite frankly, in SK Gaming. Playing off against each other here, BDS obviously getting absolutely destroyed by G2. They were able to take a game, which is obviously a good thing. Being able to take a game off of G2 is not particularly easy. Ask basically every other team in the LEC over the course of this year how simple that is, but they didn't look very good in their 3 losses. That certainly wasn't the case. There are a lot of things that I think this team has really struggled with over the past month or so. I think their individual performances have certainly declined quite a bit, but their macro has been particularly bad, and I think that was something they actually did relatively well in spring. It was something where it really started to feel like they found their style as we move further along in the spring split, but as we got into summer, everything just kind of stopped working. I think they kind of got called out and caught out a bit more playing that one individual style, and they didn't necessarily adapt in the same kind of way that maybe some of the other teams that ended up getting a little bit better results in the summer split did end up adapting. But there is still a lot of individual talent on this team. Adam is an incredibly good top laner, arguably one of the best in the entire LEC. Sheo has really stepped his play up. Crowny and Labrov have been really good over the course of this year, even if they haven't been good as of late, really, at all. And then Nuke is someone who I'm lower on, but still is a serviceable mid laner, and it's not like SK's mid laner is going to be blowing everybody out of the water either. I think that, you know, BDS from an on-paper standpoint is definitely the more talented of these 2 teams, and I think over the course of this year, they've looked like it. SK obviously doing most of their damage in the winter split all the way back, you know, months and months and months ago, but BDS, I think, has been a little bit more competitive over the course of this year, and I think that for the most part, is going to give them a pretty big advantage in this series. But for SK, this is a team that you really can't ever count out. They pretty much have always overperformed expectations. People really weren't all that into this roster, me included, at the beginning of the year. I saw a lot of upside because I really like Marcoon. I liked Irrelevant going into this year. I really liked that Misfits team last year. Exakick and DOS, I think, were big positives, specifically in winter, where they looked like maybe the best bot lane in the LEC. Certus has had some breakout moments where he's looked really good as well. There are definitely positives to this team. The problem is that, again, they also feel pretty one-dimensional as a team. I think a lot of LEC teams do kind of gain the reputation of being kind of one-dimensional, having a style that they like to play, and when they don't necessarily get that, they do significantly worse. I think SK does fall into that as well, and I think, unfortunately for them, a lot of people would look at their talent and say that they're just not on the same level as a team like BDS. However, I really like some of these players, and they really have overperformed basically all year long. Marcoon is really, really good. Incredibly underrated for how much value he adds to this team. Exakick, I think, think is, a potential elite level AD carry. I don't think he's been consistently that over the course of this year, but he certainly has the talent to hit that. Dost has been solid. Certus can have some really good games. Irrelevant's very consistent. I think there are positives, but they're going to need to put it all together in order to come out on top in this series. But who's going to be able to do that? Who's going to be moving on? Well, we're going to find out starting game by game with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Team BDS. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and we can talk about it. This wasn't exactly the cleanest game of all time from either of these two teams. A little bit of a fiesta where both teams definitely made some major mistakes, but BDS doing enough right throughout the game to be able to take the victory, to be able to take the game 1 win, and to be able to take a lot of the momentum in this series. Again, I talk about how game 1 is very important. I think it's almost less so in the LEC. I think it's very important in the eastern regions like the LCK, like the LPL, because I do think that confidence and momentum really can drastically change how those teams end up playing. I think in the LEC, basically every game kind of feels like a coin flip, if we're being entirely honest, between some of these teams. And so, while momentum is obviously a really good thing to get, I certainly don't think it's the end of the world like it is in some of the other regions if you lose game number 1, but you're still at a deficit. You're still putting yourself at a little bit of a disadvantage, and so you really want to be able to kind of put yourself in a nice position in the series, and I don't think that SK really did that. BDS kind of getting lucky that SK did it worse than them in game number 1, because I genuinely just don't think either of these teams played all that well, but we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game was pretty difficult. I don't think anybody really stood out as having a phenomenal game. I think for most of this game, I would have said it was Crowny on this Xayah. I thought he did a really good job of being able to exert pressure, specifically in the mid game, but he made a monumental error towards the back half of the game that almost single-handedly lost BDS the game. We'll talk about that when we get there, but player of the game is going to go to Sheo in the jungle for me. I just continue to see Ivern as one of the best picks in the entire game. I know a lot of teams have really started to move away from him, but the LEC certainly has not. There is still a lot of priority on Ivern in the jungle in Europe, and I think that that is the right call. I still think that Ivern does so much for your team, and you can basically plug and play him in any comp. There are a lot of high damage threats in both of the carry roles right now, that being mid and bot, that I think Ivern is almost always going to be useful for trying to facilitate those champions, even if they're not, like, directly the most dominating units. Like, maybe if you look at SK's comp, maybe an Ivern wouldn't fit with Taliyah plus Ezreal, but, like, I do think it fits with Azir plus Xayah. I certainly do think that Ivern can make a big impact there. I thought Sheo played really well. I thought he did a good job in the late game of being able to establish pressure, being able to get all the objectives that they needed, and, really closing the game out. I don't think it was, like, a dominating performance from him, but I do think it was good enough. I think Nuke certainly didn't make any sort of major errors this game. He's been a lot better, I think, in the recent weeks than he was throughout a lot of the regular season, where it was really looking like he was starting to struggle again, get back to that form that he was on in previous years before, this year on BDS, but he's been a lot better, I think a lot more consistent. Still not a superstar in that mid lane spot, but someone that's more than good enough to be able to win with. Adam was fine. I think he was, I don't want to say irrelevant, but he was good enough. On the Cassante, really didn't need to do a whole ton. We'll talk about some of the mistakes that his opposing top laner ended up making towards the back half of the game, and like I said, bot lane was good, I guess, for a majority of this game, specifically Crowny, who I think was doing a lot of good things. However, a couple of major mistakes from both of these bot lane members in the back half of the game. Crowny getting caught at Raptors was just, I don't even know. I don't really know what to explain how that happened. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know what was going through his head, but that almost single-handedly lost BDS the game, but Labrov, a couple of really bad engages throughout the game as well. The bot lane definitely was a little bit shaky, but for the most part, they were certainly good enough, and I think BDS, as a team, made less major errors than SK, and that's probably why they're going to be walking out of game number 1 with the win. But then for SK on the other side, basically everybody making some monumental errors. I would have, given a lot of praise to a player like Certus in the mid lane on this Taliyah in this game if he didn't make, like, a major brain fart towards the back half of the game where Ocean Soul is coming up and he backs to go and buy Death Cap with no teleport available, so he's just not there for the fight. It's a 4v5 at Ocean Soul, which is just unbelievable. Like, I don't know if he just forgot he didn't have teleport, but that is a monumental error to make in a series as important as this one. I think obviously he played well outside of that, but that's a problem, and you can't really get away with that. I think the bot lane for SK was honestly better throughout a lot of the game. Exekick did a good job of being able to capitalize on some of the late game mistakes. He was dealing quite a bit of damage on the Ezreal by the time we hit the late game. I certainly don't think Dost played poorly either. I think the bot lane was definitely the big positive part of SK gaming, at least throughout the entire game. Certus was definitely in that as well if he didn't make that major error with recalling, but I think top side of the map really wasn't all that good for SK in this game. Irrelevant is going to get my dud of the game. Couple of major errors for him on the Gnar. Just a lot of really bad positioning in the back half of the game, dying way too quickly. This is a champion that we've seen do work, not only here in the LEC, but basically in every region. But in this game, it wasn't really given the opportunity to do so. I think Irrelevant played kind of poorly. Marcoon certainly didn't have a ton of jungle pressure. There's only so much you can do towards the back half of the game, but I would have liked to see him be a little bit more aggressive in some some of these engages, to be going in on Maokai, trying to get on priority targets, because outside of Ivern shields, like, this team can be blown up relatively easily if you do get onto the Azir, if you do blow Xayah ultimate early in a fight. And so there are things I think that you can do in order to pressure BDS, and it didn't feel like there was enough aggression coming out from SK. But just in general, I think both teams' macro was really bad. I think that there were a couple of major mechanical misplays in this game from both teams. It just wasn't very clean. BDS is going to walk out of the win, but I think both teams have a lot to prove in game number 2. Now, if BDS takes a 2-0 series lead, we're probably going to forget about game number 1. But if SK is able to tie up the series, I do think it's anybody's game. I think, it's going to be interesting to see if either team can get a little bit more consistent as this series goes on. But who's going to be able to take it? Is BDS going to take control of this series, or is SK going to even it all out? Well, the winner of game number 2 was BDS. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they're really going to take full control. If game 1 was just a complete mess from both sides, with neither really being able to generate the kind of pressure that I think they were looking for, game 2 was a little bit more focused from BDS. I still have a few concerns about some of their macro decisions, but I think their draft in general was just a ton better in this game, and it really did kind of push them across the finish line. And then for SK on the other side, when you're talking about the team that really wanted to fight back and try to even up the series, they're just not playing well. I think this is really exposing some of the weaknesses that they had throughout the entire year. This is a team that has been very up and down, a lot of downs at times. I predicted them to not even be in the top 8 in Summer Split when they, kind of came into the season. Now, obviously, they overperformed that, but I think a lot of those concerns are coming through in this series here. I think they have a couple of very obvious win conditions, and if they don't hit those, a lot of the other players on their team just aren't going to be able to live up to maybe the hype that some people have set for them. But let's go ahead and talk about this game. Of course, starting with BDS, player of the game for me is going to go to Crowny in the bot lane. Really good to see him have a better game here in game number 2. I was a bit concerned about his performances in game number 1, specifically his major error at the end of the game. He was pretty good for most of that first game, but just a lot more consistent over the course of this one. Now, he does have the Kai'Sa, which obviously is going to be a boost, a benefit, because Kai'Sa is just ridiculously strong at the current moment, but you still got to be able to hit those W's. You still have to be able to perform in a lot of those team fights, and I think Crowny was probably the most consistent member at being able to do that over the course of the game. Now, I would be remiss to not talk about the mid gap in this game as well. I do think that nuke was really good for BDS in this game on the Xerath. We've seen this pick both be incredibly impactful and also incredibly irrelevant in a bunch of different regions across the world. So very high variance that I think you get with Xerath, because I do think you have to play around him relatively well. But I think if you go for this version of, like, the long-range artillery comp that we've often seen with, like, Jace and Kai'Sa in the mid lane, I actually think this might be a little bit more consistent, especially if teams don't have a really easy way of dealing with the Xerath. Now, you're doubling up on AP damage, which can be a problem if you're going into quite a few tanks, but SK actually went for an Enchanter support in this game, which opens up the door for you to potentially be a little bit more aggressive when it comes to picking something like the Xerath, and I do think that it very much worked out. I think the team played off of the Xerath incredibly well. Nuke didn't really make any sort of errors. In fact, he was doing a lot of really good damage, positioning himself incredibly well, and I do think the 2 carry roles of BDS were the most important in this game for them, which is a very, very big thing to say. I very much have doubted Nuke over the course of this year, not as a good player, but as a great player, as someone who can emerge as like a top 4, mid laner in the region. Certus obviously not the toughest of competition, which we will get into in just a second, but Nuke is definitely stepping up when the team really needs him to right now. They put a lot of trust in him by picking him this Xerath in this game, and I do think he repaid that. I do think Labrov also played incredibly well on the Rakan. Very, very cool to see him have, the highest KP in the game and also not die. That's a very difficult thing to end up doing on a champion like Rakan, but if you play him well, if you can get those engages off, if you can be really consistent on him, then it's going to be a pretty easy game for you to be able to win, and I think Labrov continued to play well. Adam had the nice counter pick in the top lane into the Renekton. I think we're going to see the Renekton be a relatively weak pick in this series, as it has been in a lot of other series recently, especially because it's just very counterable if you get that counter pick option. It's not nearly as safe as a blind pick as I think people give it credit for. And then I think Shea was good as well. I think BDS in general just played really, really well. I want to give credit to Crowny and Nuke, though, because I do think that they were the primary carries of this game. And then for SK on the other side, I don't hate this draft. I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say it's way too slow. I don't hate that idea, especially against a team like BDS that has struggled macro-wise specifically in the recent weeks. If you think you can survive in the early game, perhaps just out-macro, out-team fight the opposition, then go for that. But the problem is that you got in a pretty big hole early game. You didn't really have any sort of pressure on the map, and so Sedge really couldn't kind of do the thing that she wanted to do, which is generate pressure early against Maokai. You lost a ton of pressure in the mid lane. The Azir basically had no impact on this game, but most of all, I just don't think you played the comp comp very well. You continuously tried to stay aggressive, and specifically, I think my dud of the game, DOS, did not have a very good one. He picked the Milio, which I think is a good idea. I certainly don't hate Milio. I think that that champion is significantly better than people are giving him credit for right now. I do think that the nerfs definitely hit him, and he's not in, like, the best state in the entire game. He's not pick or ban like he was for many months at the beginning of the year, but I do think that he's still a very playable support, and we've been seeing a lot of really good teams, namely T1 and D plus Kia over in the LCK, continue to really value enchanters, and I do think it very much works. I think enchanters are still in a really good spot. If you want to pick things like Lulu or Milio, I still think you can play off of them relatively well. The problem is that he didn't play like he was playing Milio. He played like he was playing an engager, and that's just not how you can play this comp, right? You have to be able to play slow, but Milio was constantly moving around the map, constantly looking for skirmishes in the mid game, and I do think it really set SK back a considerable amount. I don't think that was a good idea, and I definitely think it hurt their gameplay, but Certus getting completely outclassed in the mid lane, I certainly don't think helped. Marcoon losing a ton of pressure in the jungle because he didn't have any early winning lanes, I don't think helped. Exakick, I think, played fine on the Zeri, same thing with the Relevant, but neither of them really, changed the game at all. They certainly weren't carrying by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't a 1 or a 2v9 or anything like that. It was just, they were not awful. They weren't as bad as everybody else on the team. SK just looks like they're being outclassed. They went for a strategy that I don't think they were ready to pull off, and they didn't pull it off, and I think that that's always going to be a bit of a negative. So they're now down 0-2. This is a must-win in game number 3, or else their 2023 season is going to come to an end, but BDS has the opportunity right now to send themselves to an international best-of-5 in a clean sweep. So are they going to be able to finish it off, or is SK going to keep this series alive? Well, the winner of game number 3 was BDS. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series 3-0 in a clean sweep, and they're going to qualify for their first ever international best of 5. Congratulations to this org. They definitely deserve it, not only after this series, but for what they've done over the course of this year, really surpassing all expectations. I was incredibly low on this team. I thought they had talent, but I didn't think they were going to be able to put it together. In fact, I thought they were going to be one of the worst teams in the LEC, and that has absolutely not been the case. They are one of the top 4 teams, and I think that that's got to be considered a major success. Now, their journey is obviously not over. Even their run in this season finals is not over just yet. We'll kind of talk about why I don't have a ton of optimism that they're going to go a ton further than this, more so towards the end of the video. But for SK, this is the end of the line. You got an opportunity here in the season finals. I think a lot of people really wanted to see maybe some other teams qualify for this, but SK not really bringing the heat in this series in particular. They really didn't look all that good, and we'll kind of talk about that when we get to them. But let's go ahead and start it off with BDS and my player of the game and player of the series, which is going to go to Crowny in the bot lane. Really, really important to see him perform incredibly well in this series. That's not to say he didn't make some mistakes. I think he has 1 or 2 moments every single game that are definitely still a little bit questionable, and that might hold this team back, which we'll talk about, going a bit further. But outside of that, he was basically perfect in this series. When he was playing well, he was really, really playing well, and so that's going to be a big positive for them. He's been a major contributing factor towards why this team has been a lot better than expectation over the course of this year. And when he's playing at his top level, when he's playing like, a top 1, top 2 AD carry in Europe, then this team can beat basically anybody. Like, they're going to be incredibly consistent. However, I am a little bit concerned that that is what it takes in order for this team to win. Now, it wasn't a problem here against SK, but when, Crowny struggled a bit against G2, against a better bot lane, this team didn't really look like they were going to be able to fight back all that much. It's good to see Crowny performing as well as he had here, but we're going to need to see it continue over a larger period of time, in my opinion, before I feel entirely confident about him as a player. The rest of the team, I think, also played well. Nuke had a really good series, and honestly, he's been pretty consistent over the past month or so, and I think that's what you want to say about him. He doesn't necessarily need to be the biggest hyper carry in the entire world in the mid lane, right? Some of these other teams have major carry players in the mid lane. I don't think Nuke has to be that. You've got carry players in the top lane. You've got a carry player in the bot lane. Like, you've got carries across the map from you. You don't need Nuke to be the guy, but if he can be consistently winning lane, consistently useful in team fights, and never really behind in gold, always up in tempo and in pressure, that's fantastic for BDS, and that was really what I think spurred them on in spring, was how good Nuke was in the early game. He was that again in this series against SK. Now, going against Certus isn't exactly the most difficult challenge in the entire world. Serta certainly struggled this entire series, specifically in that game number 2, but I think Nuke being able to show up and just being better than him, I think is a very big positive for this team overall. I thought LeBron was pretty consistent, wasn't exactly like this big playmaker, didn't, jump off the page in terms of some of the engages and the plays that he was making, but I think he was really consistent over the course of this series, and again, that's all that he really needs to be. If Crownie's going to be able to step up and play the game incredibly fast and be this big damage carry, then if Lebrov can just be there to facilitate him, not even to create, because we had creators on this team, that's going to be massive for him and for this team. I think in general, he played his role this series well. Sheo was solid. I don't think he was perfect. Game 1 was very questionable, but I think the rest of this series was good, specifically this game number 3, where I think he was a lot better on the Sejuani. This team still puts a ridiculous amount of pressure on Dragon, as opposed to anything else on the map. They're willing to give over Herald, they're willing to give over Baron at times to get Dragon Soul, which is crazy to me, but I think that's just kind of Sheo and BDS's mentality and their priority, but I think Sheo in teamfights played really well. SK certainly struggled at dealing with the Sejuani towards the back half of the game, and I think that was major in game number 3. Adam definitely had his questionable moments, but I certainly don't think he was a major negative, and if you roll well on Adam, basically in any series, it's not really going to matter, right? Like, form doesn't particularly matter for Adam. He's either going to have a good series or a bad series, and there's really not a lot that we can do to predict whether or not that's going to happen. I think he wasn't, super sharp in this one, but who's to say he can't be better in the next one? So, nice win for BDS overall. They're going to move on to face the winner of the series that we're going to talk about after this in this video, but this is a really nice win, and they've got to be excited about that. And then for SK on the other side, this is unfortunately how your season's going to end, certainly with a whimper and not with a bang, which is probably not what you wanted to see. I don't particularly think anybody on the team played well in this series. I think you can point to some circumstances where players did impress. I think Irrelevant wasn't a major negative for this team in the top lane. He certainly wasn't creating a ton of action, but you could argue that he was better than Adam in this series. Not that it really matters because of how Irrelevant top lane was, pun entirely intended, but I think everybody else on the team really did underperform. My dud of the game in game 3 is going to go to Marcoon in the jungle. It really just felt like a lot of his engages on Vi weren't working, and if you lose in the early game on Vi, you're doomed, especially with the rest of this comp where you've got the Akali, you've got the Xayah, you're going into Cassio and Zeri and Sejuani and a lot of these things that are going to team fight just straight up better than you, and we'll talk about it now. SK's team fighting was miserable throughout this entire series. Their front to back ability was really, really bad, and I think some of that has to be put on Marcoon. I think some of that has to be put on DOS, who I think was really bad in this series. Certainly a couple of flaws exposed. He was really, really big for this team in winter, but it feels like he specifically in this bot lane has fallen off considerably ever since that time. I certainly don't think Exakick is entirely free of blame, but I don't think Exakick was nearly as bad as people are going to give him credit for in this series. I think he was fine. I think DOS had a lot of really bad moments, really bad engages, really bad roam timers, just not really aware of the game state, just things that I wouldn't expect a top 6 team like support to make, and that's unfortunately the situation that we kind of fell into. I think Serta's had his best game of the series here on one of his signature picks in Akali, but he really wasn't all that relevant in terms of damage towards the back half. I think in general, SK just felt completely overpowered and overmatched in this series, and BDS, for their credit, didn't even really look all that good, and so SK, not really a team that I think a lot of people are going to rate very highly after the series, but it doesn't really matter. Their season is over. Going to be interesting to see what they do in the offseason. They have a couple of interesting young players. I really like Exakick, and I do like Marcoon quite a bit. Irrelevant's been good over the course of this year. It's going to be interesting to see the direction that they might move in with the rest of that roster, but I think they have a good young core if they want to stick with it, or potentially they can blow it up and maybe send some of these nice young pieces to a potential contender and maybe try again with some other young pieces and another young core. It'll be interesting to see which direction they go in, but for BDS, they are going to move on. They're not done here in the season finals. There's certainly definitely still some question marks about what this team is going to be able to do, but at least for now, moving on is the most important thing, and guaranteeing yourself an international best of 5, whether that's at Worlds or in the Worlds qualifying series, is definitely going to be a positive for an org that I think a lot of people were really counting out at the beginning of the year. But now moving on to our second series of this lower bracket, round number 1, and this is the one that I think a lot of more people were interested in seeing. I think it's a very, very intriguing matchup. It's unfortunate that I think only one of these teams is going to be moving on to international play, because I think you could argue that they are the 2 best teams in the lower bracket, but here we are. One of these 2 teams from the same country is going to knock the other out. Who's going to win the Brexit battle? Of course, it's a matchup between the number 4 seeded Excel Esports and the number 5 seeded Fnatic. Really, really excited to see these 2 teams go head to head. I think both of them have very, very good qualities. Obviously, both of them finishing in the top 3 in the summer split. Facing off against each other here is definitely disappointing. Excel I think in particular, probably disappointed to be here. They got absolutely destroyed by Mad Lions in the upper bracket. That was a series that they went in as favorites, and they ended up getting swept, not just beaten, which is certainly not what you expected or anticipated or wanted for this team, but they just couldn't quite get the job done against them. I think Mad did a lot of things right in that series, and Excel, I think, really struggled to adapt to maybe some of the things that Mad was throwing at them. Mad obviously upped their, gameplay a lot from what they were showing off in summer, but Excel still has a lot of hype, and they still have a lot of potential, I think, surrounding them, but this was a team that was able to beat Fnatic, just a couple of months ago, or a month or whatever ago, in the semifinals of the LEC Summer Split, so they should be the favorites coming into this series as well. However, Fnatic Mojo, I think, would say otherwise. This is a team, this is an org that seems to always be able to get the job done when it matters the most, no matter how they played in the regular season. Look at last year when everybody counted them out from being able to make Worlds. They go on that playoff run in the lower bracket, they're able to make the World Championships, beating Excel to get there, mind you, and, I think a lot of people are kind of underestimating their ability to do that again. In my previous video, my upper bracket round 1 video, I predicted Fnatic to be able to win this series because I just think the mojo is too strong, but like I said there, I think either team could take this. If either was better, I wouldn't be surprised. If Excel just repeated the performance that they put on in the Summer Split playoffs and were able to take down Fnatic relatively cleanly, I'm not going to be entirely surprised because, again, we've already seen it, but if Fnatic levels up, if Razork and Humanoid in particular start playing like the playoff versions of themselves that seem to always show up when they need them the most, then I do think Fnatic should be able to take this series. But it's going to be an interesting one, basically no matter what. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis, starting, of course, with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Fnatic. They are going to take the first game of the series. They're going to go up 1-0. They're going to take control. And they're going to generate a lot of momentum with this win, which I do think is the most important thing that you can say here. I think players like Razork, players like Humanoid, hell, even someone like Trimby, I think really thrive off of feeling good, feeling confident, feeling like you can take a lot of those risks that you like to take, and especially playing early game very quickly. And so for Fnatic to be able to take this first game, I think is a really big dub. Now, a lot of people are going to look at these two drafts and say that they are not even in terms of, what they were able to get, and I kind of agree. Like, usually I'm going to push back on LEC fans because nobody likes to complain about draft more than LEC fans. I mean, it is honestly just absurd. Like, every single game is not draft diff. I know that, a lot of content creators for the LEC will say otherwise, but I don't agree, right? Draft diff can only get you so far. A lot of times when teams lose, it's because they played their comp poorly, but I do think that draft definitely had a factor in this game. It's just crazy to get Kaisa on R4. I think that that's a pretty insane draft, and I think in general getting Ivern and Jace and Kaisa and Rel, like, these are all strong picks. Like, yes, I do want to kind of counter back with the fact that, Excel got Xayah and Excel got Sejuani, and these are the champions that I would consider arguably the best in their roles as well, and so it's not like they got nothing of power in this current meta, but to allow Kaisa to fall through even second ban phase is just very surprising. To ban out the Aphelios over the Kaisa is definitely surprising, even though it is Noah, but Fnatic executed it a lot better, and, we're talking about a lot of these overtuned, overpowered champions that Fnatic ended up getting. Well, the one that isn't really all that overtuned is the one who's going to get player of the game for me, and that's going to be Oscar Ridden in the top lane, who I thought was fantastic in this game on the Gwen. Really did destroy that counterpick matchup. We've seen actually this not be super Gwen favored over the course of pro history, mostly because Cassante is just crazy consistent. But, Gwen in theory is something that beats Cassante, and we definitely saw why in this matchup. Odoamne on the other side has kind of been the rock for Excel over the course of this year, certainly the most consistent player that they have. And so for Oscar to just kind of take him down and demolish him in this game, I think is very impressive. I'm going to, kind of talk about this a little bit here, but, in hindsight, it's even more impressive considering what we know now about Oscar Ridden being injured, needing surgery on his hand. For him to be able to dominate this game number 1 like this, when he's hurt, I think is even more impressive. We'll talk about that a bit more obviously later, but really good stuff in game 1 from Oscar. I thought Razork was obviously great. Ivern is just a huge pick. It's probably going to be a huge pick. Basically the rest of the series, LEC seems to be the only region that really does value Ivern as much as I think he deserves at the current moment. I think you could argue he's the number 1 jungler in the game. I do think it's arguable. I think Sejuani is also really good, and Rel, I think, can create a lot as well, but Ivern is definitely up there for me. Maokai, I didn't even mention Maokai. Maokai is definitely up there as well, but I think Ivern is arguably the most consistent, and it just allows your carries to be able to take over the game in the way that you want, and take over they did. Trimby was awesome in setting everything up as well when you've got shields going in, potentially on the Gwen, potentially on the Kaisa if she wants to dive the backline with the Ivern, and then all of a sudden you've got Rel setting everything up. This comp becomes a lot easier to play, and I think Fnatic definitely showed that off. Humanoid did everything he was supposed to in the early game, when Humanoid has good early games, Fnatic tends to win. That's been his big weakness over the course of the last few years, and so giving him something like Jace that he can be proactive on in the early game, I do think is a positive. Just in general, I think everybody on Fnatic really stepped up in this first game, and I think it was exactly what you wanted to see. And then for Excel on the other side, I just don't think they played all that well. I think, again, you can sit here and yell at draft and yell at comp and, yada, 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 but I just don't think it's that big of a deal, right? Like, this was a winnable game for Excel. You have some advantages here. You should have better map control in the early game. You should be able to play off of Talia Sejuani relatively quickly into the game, and you should be able to kind of dominate that mid jungle and start moving around the map to create tempo advantages. The problem with that is Peach did not have a very good game on the Sejuani. He lost a lot of pressure in the early game, really gave Razork a ton of tempo, and from that point onwards, all of a sudden the game does become significantly more difficult to deal with because now the Jace is the one that's going to be moving around, which is a problem. So Peach is going to get my dud of the game. I think Peach has been fine throughout their playoff run. I certainly don't think he's been the carry for this team, but I think he's been more than serviceable, which is better than I think what they've been getting out of that jungle position all year long. I just don't think that he really played this game one all that well. His early game needed to be better on Sej, and Sej has a very underrated levels 1 to 6. I really do believe that that champion can do quite a bit, even more so than some of the other junglers that a lot of people consider to be strong at that part of the game, and I just don't think Peach capitalized on that well at all, in my opinion. I think Odo obviously really struggled. He had been really the rock for, like I said earlier, for Excel. He had been by far their most consistent player over the course of their playoff run, even over the course of their losses. He was someone who basically never underperformed for this team, but this was not a good game one from him, which is certainly not, it's certainly eye-opening, but in the wrong kind of way. And then Abadage, Patrick, Limit, they were fine. They weren't game breakers, but they weren't game losers either. I would have liked to see a little bit more aggression come out from the two carries in Abadage and Patrick, but really only so much you can do once your jungle gets super far behind, when your top lane is losing as hard as he is. There really isn't a lot of avenues to be able to open up from there, but I do think Excel has a lot of ways to get back into this series. I think if you just get a little bit more consistent in the early game, that's going to be the part of the game that is the most important in this series for both teams. So if you're going to be able to win that, you're going to be in a good spot. But for Fnatic, you really want to be able to take that 2-0 series lead. The momentum and the confidence that you generated here is great, but if you were to throw that all away by getting demolished in game 2, it's not really going to mean a whole ton. So is Fnatic going to be able to take that strong lead, or is Excel going to be able to tie the series up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Excel. They are going to take the second game of this series. They are going to tie it up at 1 apiece, which is obviously incredibly important. You wanted to be able to tie that series up. You certainly don't want to drop to 2-0 against Fnatic, a team that is very talented and very well is probably going to win one of the final 3 games of the series, especially with that kind of confidence and momentum. But they did it in a way that I think a lot of people aren't going to appreciate nearly as much as they deserve. I think, again, Fnatic got basically everything they wanted in draft. I think they went for a strategy that they felt like they could execute. They clearly like this long-range artillery combo with some engaged threats as well as the Ivern. That's clearly what they want to prioritize. They again got Kai'Sa on R4, but Excel went for something that can be a little bit more, game-breaking in the latter half of the game if they needed it, with the Zeri instead of the Xayah. Now, normally, I would think this would be weaker. I would think that you would actually be handicapping yourself in this instance. I think Xayah gives you a lot more flexibility for how you want to play the game, but I think a big takeaway that people aren't talking about in terms of this draft is the Rel. I think going from from Rel to Alistar, if you're Fnatic, is a big deal, and I think losing that Gwen on the top side and taking the Cassante instead, I also think is a little bit of a problem. I don't think you have nearly as much damage as you think you do, especially in the early to mid game here. And I think that they had to learn that the hard way, and he can't really rely entirely on Humanoid because what we've seen from him and from this team is that they don't really play off of him all that well. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is maybe surprisingly going to go to Odoamne in the top lane on this Gnar. Thought this was a much better game from him in game number 2 than it was in game 1. Some of those engages towards the back half of the game were probably the most important thing that Excel did. Now, Patrick absolutely has earned this as well. If you want to give this to Patrick, I'm certainly not going to decline you. Patrick was phenomenal on Zeri, and I think that the difference really in game number 2 from game number 1 was Patrick stepping up and being significantly more consistent in terms of the damage that he was able to do in some of the mid-game skirmishes. We'll talk about Fnatic's early game when we get to them, but they really struggled at being able to generate tempo, and I think really the big shakeup for Excel, and the reason that they were able to do that much more consistently was, first of all, obviously, I think Peach had a better game, I think Limit was on a better champion, but Patrick, I think, really stepped up and was like a major carry in a lot of these fights. Now, he wasn't the only one to play well. Odo and Patrick weren't the only two to step up. I do think everybody played well. Peach certainly had a better early early game, which again is what you should do in this matchup. Not that Ivern is particularly easy to punish, but Sedge can have so much pressure and tempo on the map to be able to create the plays that she wants to make that you should be able to get Ahri on the map and moving and try to create a lot of these early game skirmishes to punish the Kai'Sa, to punish the Ivern, to punish these champions that really want to try to group and get to that mid game as fast as possible. And I think Excel executed on that a lot better in this one. Abbedagga was significantly more active. Humanoid was very much a target for this team in the early game, and I do think they executed on that. Like I said, Peach was good. Limit was a lot more aggressive and a lot more consistent on the Rel, and I think that that's always going to be kind of the case. Rel is just a really good champion right now. In general, it felt like Excel was a lot more consistent, a lot more, I don't know, efficient, and a lot more clinical on their execution. I think that's what really matters in the end for them, and I think it's what got them this win. And then for Fnatic on the other side, it's basically everything I was talking about. This team relies so much on being able to generate pressure in the early game and being able to move their jungle mid around and giving them an advantage because they're so good from ahead, they're so dominating from ahead, but they really are quite poor from behind as players, Humanoid in particular, and I think that kind of came to fruition once again. They targeted Humanoid a ton, Excel that is, in the early game, and Fnatic didn't really know how to respond. Razork's early game wasn't nearly as good, he didn't have nearly as much tempo, which is how this matchup, quite frankly, should go. And so when Humanoid was targeted, even if he was able to generate some gold, all of a sudden Peach has gold and Abbedagga has gold and Patrick has a ton of gold. And Fnatic, like I said earlier, is not a good team from behind, or at least they're not nearly as good as a lot of other teams in the LEC from behind. And I think that very much came out. Early game's going to be very important for both teams because of this in this series. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Trimby in the support position. Some of those Alistar engages were rough, man. Like, they were not good at all. And I think that that's going to happen. Like, obviously, going from Rel to Alistar, it does change how you want to play the game at least a little bit. But I would have expected something a little bit better from a player that I think has been pretty good for Fnatic over the course of this year. I just did not think that his game 2 was nearly as good as his game number 1. Said it earlier, but Oscar Rinnan ended up losing the top lane coin flip. Odo Omne was massive for Excel. He was the best player on the map, in my opinion, and Oscar didn't have nearly the same kind of impact on the Cassante. I think Razork losing in the early game, Humanoid getting targeted really put them at a big disadvantage, and Noah couldn't really do a whole ton on Kai'Sa, because that's a champion that does rely on the rest of your team doing relatively well in the early game so that you can get to the point where you can fight from even. Kai'Sa is going to be incredibly difficult, specifically with the Jace, to deal with from even, but if you're not there, if you're not at even, then all of a sudden it becomes a lot more difficult to win games and to win fights. And so, unfortunately for Fnatic, even if they got this strong draft, they couldn't execute on it. And this is just another example of why I think draft isn't nearly as important as gameplay, and Fnatic, I think, had to learn that the hard way. But it's just one loss. Again, the series is tied up. This has turned into a best of 3, which both of these teams have proven that they can win. I think game 3 is going to be very important in order to take full control of this series. If Excel can take that game number 3, I think that's going to be massive in terms of turning around that momentum, but Fnatic could answer back relatively cleanly. So who's going to be able to take that? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Excel. They are going to be able to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1 after their 0-1 start to it. And this is the Excel that I think a lot of us were hoping for in this series. The one that was going to step up and really kind of show a lot of the good developments and processes that they had shown over the course of the summer split. The one that looked pretty clearly like a top 2 team in Europe by the end of that split. Obviously, things didn't go according to plan in the upper bracket, but I think a lot of people really want to see them make Worlds and want to see them make an international tournament for the first time in their organization's history. And obviously, winning this game number 3 is a really big step in getting there. It doesn't solidify that you're going to win the series or anything like that, but it certainly puts you in a better position than losing this game number 3 would have you. You only have to win 1 of the final 2, which obviously is much better, and they did it in a good way. Fnatic still struggling, and it's a lot of the same weaknesses. You're gonna get a little bit tired of maybe hearing me say some of the things that I'm going to say about them, but every time Fnatic loses, it's basically the exact same thing, and so I'm going to continue to harp on it. But let's, of course, talk about Excel, our winners. First and foremost, player of the game for me is going to go to Patrick in the bot lane. He's been really good both of the final 2 games. Both games on Zeri in this series have been major positives. Typically, I would say that Zeri over Xayah is a very interesting choice for Excel, one that, potentially has more upside, but certainly going to be lower in terms of consistency. But if Patrick's going to be this good on Zeri, pick him every game. Like, pick Zeri every single game if he's going to be this good on it, because he really is demolishing and absolutely destroying Fnatic. He's dominating team fights. He's dominating the mid game. He's getting online faster than any Zeri really should be in this circumstance. He's honestly just playing incredibly well. He's allowed to get fed. The team really does want to put a lot of resources into him, and so everything's just kind of working out. Patrick really has been a very big deal for Excel over the past few months. Has very much flown under the radar. You're going to find people in basically every single post-match thread or Twitter thread or anything, right, that are going to talk about in their wins. No one's talking about Patrick. No one's talking about how good he is. In their losses, everyone's blaming Patrick. Everyone's saying that he makes major mistakes. It's just not an accurate representation of what Patrick offers to this team. I think him continuing to be one of the best AD carries in all of Europe over the course of Summer Split, like he had been in years past, is the reason why Excel is top 2. I think you could talk about Odo and Peach and Abadaga and Limit all playing really well, but Patrick is the carry of this team, and he has been over the course of this year. I think he continued to do that in this game here. Odo Omne was also very important on the Scion, mind-controlled Fnatic into continuously trying to focus him down in team fights. I'm really not sure why they continuously did that, but Odo was, again, very, very important. Odo and Patrick, those are the two players that I think have impressed me the most for Excel over the course of this year. I do believe they are the most important players. Now, that's not to say that everybody else on the team hasn't been stepping up. Abadaga has been the better mid laner across the last 2 games, and specifically here in Game 3, I think it was the most apparent. I think that they put a lot of attention once again into trying to shut down Humanoid, and it very much worked, and Abadaga got super far ahead because of it. Peach had a really good early game. Limit was solid on the recon. Everything continued to go their way, and again, if Excel's going to be able to play their early game as fast and as concretely as they've been able to play it over the past few games, I think that's going to benefit them greatly. And then for Fnatic on the other side, again, a lot of the flaws that I pointed out previously in this series for Fnatic all year long, they're continuing to, kind of show themselves in big series like this. Dud of the game is going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. He is the most predictable player in the LEC at this point because he is one of the best mid laners in the entire league at playing from ahead when he's given a gold lead. He's really good at being able to kind of pressure out the enemy team and close out games incredibly quickly. He's a very good player in that regard, but if he has to play from behind, if he has to play from a deficit, he's legitimately one of the worst mid laners in the entire league. He just has no idea how to play without pressure, and it continues to appear he just is way too aggressive in a ton of these situations. He doesn't know when he can step up. He's not very good at controlling vision around his lane, and so he's consistently a gank target by enemy teams. His weaknesses, I think, are just very defined at this point. We know who Humanoid is. A lot of people are going to sit here and say that he's the only problem on Fnatic. I disagree with that, but I certainly do not think that he is helping this game. Noah was really far ahead for a bit, was really strong on the Jinx, but instead of just letting the Jinx scale into the late game, consistently trying to, fight around objectives and make sure that the Jinx is in a good spot, they kept pressuring. They were way too active on the map. Trimby, Humanoid, Razork, they were continuously trying to find these skirmishes, and they were losing these skirmishes because you're going into a Poppy, you're going into a Rakan. A Zeri got a lot of gold by that time, and so all of a sudden this game becomes a lot more difficult, and I think a lot of it is macro for them. They just can't figure out when they want to fight, when they want to back off, when they want to do anything. They're just way too aggro, and I do think it's really costing them. Now, there are positives. Noah, I think, mechanically speaking, was fine up until the end game, where his positioning was really, really bad. I think Trimby, mechanically speaking, has been good throughout this series. He's landing a lot of his abilities. He just doesn't have any idea of when he wants to land those abilities, and I do think that if Razork and Humanoid can get back on track and start playing the early game a little bit more consistently, I still think Fnatic can win a lot of these games. The problem is, they need to do that. Like, that is a must for them. It's not, well, they're a lot better from ahead. If they lose early, I just think they are going to lose the game. I don't really think there's going to be a lot of salvaging that Fnatic can do. And so a big game 4 here for Fnatic, obviously. If they lose, they are eliminated from 2023, from this year. They won't be going international. And if Excel wins, they are going to be moving on. But of course, Fnatic has the chance to keep this series alive, and that's going to be really, really big for them here. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even this series up at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. Very excited to be able to say that these two teams are basically destined, I think, from this point onwards to play each other in incredibly pivotal moments, and we'll go ahead and see how it pans out in game number 5. I don't want to overhype that matchup, but we'll talk about it at the end of this before we jump into it. But we got to talk about game number 4 first and foremost. How did Fnatic tie up the series? How are we going to a game number 5? What ended up up happening? Well, Fnatic took a couple of punts on a draft that I really, really like. I really think there are a lot of interesting things here. Taliyah jungle is certainly an intriguing, pick in 2023, but I think it very much worked in their favor in this game, which we'll talk about. Noah got his Aphelios, which I think has obviously been his best champion over the course of this year, even if Aphelios isn't necessarily considered to be like the top tier AD carry at the current moment. Picking it over Kai'Sa would be a very weird move in a lot of different games, but Noah is so good at that champion that it's definitely worth it. Also, Aphelios is still really good. Oscar gets on Poppy, a champion he's done really well on, and Humanoid gets to play something like Tristana, where a lot of that early aggression can actually be beneficial for the champion, and so really like the draft here for Fnatic. And then for Excel, on the other side, they get the Razork, the Ivern for the first time this series, which is good, but they fall into a couple of traps. Specifically, I think a couple of champions that I think their players just aren't very good at, if I'm being entirely honest, which we'll get into. Also, the Zeri didn't have nearly as big of an impact, which is big, but for Fnatic, player of the game for me is pretty easily going to go to Razork in the jungle on this Taliyah. I know a lot of people are going to give this to Noah on the Aphelios because he was the one that was picking up so many of the kills, especially in the back half of this game, but I really don't think they win this game nearly as cleanly without Razork playing as well as he did on this Taliyah. Really like the pick. I think that it gives you a lot of agency. May not be the strongest early game champion, but you want mid-game pressure, you want gank pressure. Taliyah offers that in abundance, and she does a lot of damage. Like, a lot of people I think have just forgotten how good she is in the jungle, how good her ganks are. Like, I get it. Her clear isn't like the single fastest in the entire game, right? Or at least that's what I've heard of. I'm not a jungle player, someone's probably gonna yell at me. But, like, I get it. Like, maybe she doesn't optimize in the same way that some of the other big tank junglers like Maokai or Sedge do at the current moment. But Taliyah's, like, active pressure on the map is insane, and she still is really good as a champion. She's still going to offer the same things that she does as a mid laner, especially once you hit the mid to late game. She's still going to be incredibly valuable in terms of ending games, and I do think that Razork piloted her very well. He was everywhere on the map, he won a lot early, and I think that translated a lot into what the rest of the team wanted to do. The Tristana was much more active in moving around the map than the Jace ever was for Humanoid, which is always going to be very, very big. And then obviously Noah was just super fed by the end of the game on the Aphelios to be able to take over these team fights. Trimby probably had his best game of the series. Oscar played well on the top side. I just think everybody did their thing for Fnatic, and that's exactly what you needed to see. That's what you wanted to see for this team, and I think they executed what they were supposed to do. And this felt much more like what Fnatic should be playing towards than what they were playing towards in the first half of this series. But for Excel on the other side, yikes, like, is this what happens when you lose in the early game? Like, when you don't have a ton of that pressure, when you're not able to capitalize on some of Fnatic's mistakes? Because this was not good. Now, I do want to point out there were two players in particular that I think played really bad in this game for Excel. I don't think Patrick was necessarily a disaster. Didn't get nearly as fed on the Zeri, but I don't think it was necessarily his fault. He just didn't have a lot of the situations that he had in the previous games. I think Peach was fine. I think Odo was fine. Abadaga and Limit played this game so bad, like so poorly, that I think it was going to be very difficult. Now, we'll talk about Limit first, because he is my dud of the game. I don't think he's necessarily awful at Alistar, but this was a really bad Alistar game. You have to know when to engage on that champion. You have to know when it's your time to go in. But if you go in too early, especially against this comp that just has a ridiculous amount of damage, you're going to get punished so hard, and the game's going to be unwinnable. Look at these two comps. Alistar's crazy valuable this game. If you're able to get on Taliyah, especially if you're able to get on Aphelios, which is going to be hard, but if you're able to get on one of the two marksmen, like, that's huge. All of a sudden, that fight becomes significantly easier. The problem was Limit was never on the same page as the rest of the team. This was a really bad game from him, and I think it really did cost Excel quite a bit. And then Abadaga. I think I'm continuing to say the same thing about Abba. I've talked about this before on the channel, but specifically on Azir. He falls into what I consider to be the biggest Azir trap that I see so many pro players fall into. Azir is a damage dealer. You have to think of him as a carry, as a backline carry first and foremost. Yes, he can engage, he can do the cool Shreem and shuffle, but so many times I see mid laners throw away such good positioning in order to get a good shuffle off and then just die in the fight. And it's like, if you had just sat in the backline and done so much damage like Azir can do, you probably would have won the fight without the shuffle. And so Abadaga, I think, falls into that trap a lot more than almost any other mid laner, and a lot of mid laners fall into that trap, let me tell you, but so many times this game, he went for these crazy big shuffle plays only to hit some, or maybe even sometimes none, and then just die in the fight, and all of a sudden, you know, you have a Zeri who's not particularly fed, and you have an Ivern Scion Alistar who's all set up for you to try to carry on this Azir, and you can't do that. I think it was just a gross misapplication of a champion that we've seen so often, specifically in the LEC. I think Azir is, quite frankly, a trap pick in the LEC, because clearly European mid laners do not value the damage that Azir puts out. They value the shuffle, which is not particularly valuable in the current meta. When you've got engaged supports, when you've got, you know, a Scion on the top side, it's just not that valuable of an ability in comparison to what Azir does damage-wise. And so, yes, I'm a little bit frustrated when it comes to how Abbedagga and Limit played the game, but Excel can still win this. It's just one game. Again, they looked dominant in games 2 and 3. They looked like the better team at being able to capitalize on Fnatic's mistakes, but if Fnatic isn't going to make those mistakes, are they just going to be able to run away with this series? Well, we're going to find out right now because Game 5 is upon us. The winner is going to be moving on to face BDS for a chance to get into Worlds proper, and they will guarantee qualify for an international best of 5, whereas the loser will have their 2023 season cut short. Who will win? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series, and they are going to be the ones to move on to face BDS for a chance at Worlds. They have secured, at the very least, an international best of 5, and honestly, they look pretty good at the end of this series once they really started to figure out how they wanted to play some of these games. I think there's a really good chance that we could be seeing this team move directly onto the Swiss stage at the World Championships, and Fnatic just continues to do this. It's every single year. It's the players that need to step up, the most of the players that have been the biggest question marks for this team, that have always been the ones to completely change their fortunes when it matters the most. When we get around to Worlds qualification time, we're here again, baby. We're here with Humanoid stepping up in the playoffs once more. It's not the playoffs, it's the season finals, but it's basically the same thing once more here in Fnatic's going to be going to international. I can't say going to Worlds, but going international, which is huge for them. Excel, obviously going to be very disappointed. They finished second in the summer split, and they're not going to qualify for Worlds. That definitely has to feel pretty bad, but they deserve it. They had 2 opportunities to win a series, to, book their ticket to an international best of 5, and they couldn't win either of them. And so, if you're not able to do that, you're not going to be good enough to go internationally. And I understand that they were against 2 good teams, but Excel tried their best, and after a really, really confusing year, an up and down year for sure for Excel, it is going to end here in the season finals. But let's talk about Fnatic first and foremost. Player of the game and player of the series for me is going to go to Trimby, the support for Fnatic. He was phenomenal in this 5th and final game. This was the single best game of the series from either team, in my opinion, from a player. I think you could argue that Patrick's game number 3 was just as good. Patrick was phenomenal, but I think Trimby created a lot more of that action. Patrick did a really good job of being able to capitalize on basically everything that was happening in the game, but Trimby's game number 5 was about as perfect of a Nautilus game as you could possibly have. Consistently fantastic engages everywhere he needed to be on the map. Just a perfect game. I mean, really everything that you could have possibly asked for. Trimby is going to play like this. Like, this is peak Trimby. This is exactly what we were looking at last year for Rogue as, like, maybe the best support in Europe. This is what we were looking at in Winter Split, in my opinion, as somebody who really stepped up for that Koi team that really needed it. Obviously fell off a little bit in the Spring Split where I thought he was really bad, but, that Trimby is still there, and I think he definitely showed that off in this very, very pivotal game number 5. Certainly wasn't the only player who played well. I very nearly gave player of the series over to Razork in the jungle, because I do think that the 2 games of Talia were incredibly important, and I really don't think the Ivern was all that bad, even in their losses earlier in the series. The reason I didn't give it to Razork is because I don't think he had the same kind of highs. I will say, Trimby was the better and the worst player in this series, if you will, where I think his good plays were much better than Razork's, but I do think his bad games were, like, worse than Razork's, and so, however you want to take that, I think Razork was very consistent over the course of this series, and definitely was a positive for Fnatic. Specifically, I think the Talia pick was a very, very big positive, and certainly something that I think helped them out a ton in closing out this series. Humanoid was much better on the Tristana than he ever was on the Jace. That transition was a major positive for Fnatic, and I think it definitely went in their direction. Noah was crazy consistent at just being able to capitalize on a lot of what the rest of the team was able to generate. Not that he played bad at all, just that I think he did exactly what his role was to do, which was to end fights, especially towards the back half of games. And then Oscar. Honestly, Oscar should be in the player of the series conversation. Incredibly consistent, was awesome in game 1 on the Gwen. Really a lot of good stuff coming in from him as well, and so Fnatic genuinely deserves this win. There really is no other way to put it. They were the better team in this series, and I think the better team ended up coming out on top. But for Excel, that's got to be disappointing. I mean, again, finishing second in Summer Split, really putting yourself in a decent position, bringing G2 to 5 games in the upper bracket finals, playing against them in finals, looking relatively good, having beaten Fnatic just about a month ago in the playoffs. Like, a lot of things were moving in your direction to make you feel pretty confident about being able to make Worlds for the first time in your organization's history, but running into Fnatic has been a curse for them. It was a curse last year. It was a curse again this year. They weren't able to get it done, and honestly, they have no one to blame but themselves. They really threw this series away towards the end. When they were up 2-1, 2-1 after 3 games, it really should have been a clean end, but I think a lot of their players ended up underperforming at the end of the series, and they couldn't quite adapt to what Fnatic ended up adapting to, which was always going to be a bit of a problem. Done of the game for me in Game 5 is going to go to Peach. I really don't think Peach had a very good series at all here. Razork was definitely better as a jungler in all 5 games, and I think that was a big problem for Excel. Again, I think Excel really thrives off of being able to generate early leads. Maybe not that as much as Fnatic really struggles at being able to handle early deficits, and Peach was going to be a big deal for that. Jungle's always going to be important in terms of setting the tempo for the game, but I don't think Peach was very good, and honestly, Peach really wasn't a game changer for me in their playoff run. I think people rate him really highly because the team got better when he was put in, and I do rate him as a good jungler. I don't think I rate him as a great jungler, and I think the series did prove some of his weaknesses. I think Limit also really started to show some of the cracks in the armor, if you will. He had been someone that I think was really overperforming expectations, was someone who I was not high on at all. When Excel picked him up, I was really not a big fan of his time on BDS or on Schalke, but coming into Excel, I think he really started to show some of the promise and some of the positives that people were picking him up for, but I mean, he just got completely outplayed by Trimby in this series. There really is no other way around it. His games 4 and 5 were absolutely miserable, and were a big reason why they lost. Abadaga was obviously bad in Game 4, was definitely better here in Game 5, but only so much you can do on a champion like Ahri. Patrick was strong, but wasn't able to take over the same game because his supporting cast wasn't nearly as good. Odoamne wasn't the same kind of, constant presence in the top lane, although I certainly don't think he was a big problem in this series at all. I just don't think Excel really deserved to go with the series that they played here, and that's how it is sometimes. That just is how it do be. Before Excel, that's 2023. You're going to have a lot of positives, a lot of negatives. It is going to be very intriguing to see the direction that this org ends up going in. They went all in this year with a lot of players that I think a lot of people were really excited about. Going to be interesting to see if they want to continue to be a contender or if they go for maybe a little bit more of a youth movement, considering things didn't work out. I think either direction is going to be intriguing to say the least, but, Excel's year is definitely going to be a fun one to look back on. But for Fnatic, their year is no longer over. They are going to be going to an international best of 5. They've got that matchup against BDS, which we will preview in just a second, but congratulations to this team, Fnatic, going to an international event, being able to win when it matters the most. That is inevitable, and they did it yet again in a series like this. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Season Finals Lower Bracket Round 1 overview and analysis video. We know our 4 teams from the LEC that are going to be representing Europe internationally this year. 2 of those teams, G2 and Mad, having qualified upper bracket-wise, but Fnatic and BDS joining that club here today. They will face off next weekend for an opportunity to automatically qualify for Worlds without the Worlds qualifying series. The other, I should say, will have to face Golden Guardians in a best of 5 to see who ends up going into the play-in stage, but very, very interesting series. It's time to quickly preview what I think is going to happen next week. We're going to start off with Fnatic and BDS because that's going to be the first series. Really intriguing to see these 2 teams go head-to-head. I think in terms of current form, you could argue that BDS is in better form because of what they did against SK. They were able to clean sweep them. They looked pretty good. They were able to take a game off of G2, which I think is a confidence booster, but I think Fnatic is just the better team. I'm going to predict Fnatic to be able to win this series. I think they are more talented. I think BDS's flaws are still very apparent, and I think they rely so much on Crownie and Adam in particular to be able to win games and for Nuke to be the better mid laner, or at the very least a stable mid laner, and I'm not sure all 3 of those things are going to be able to happen against Fnatic. BDS might be the better bot lane, but Noah and Trimby were really good in that series against Excel. Trimby in particular, and I think if Crownie struggles, that could be a problem. I think if Adam can't quite get the same kind of lead against not Oscar Inen, but actually Wunder, which we'll talk about in a second, then I think that's going to be a problem. And of course, if Humanoid has a good series, that's going to be a problem. Razork's a good player. I think that there are a lot of things going against BDS in this series that lead me to believe that Fnatic is going to be able to take it. But like I said, one thing of note, Oscar Inen was hurt. I talked about this a bit in the series, but he had a major hand injury. I think he's getting surgery this week. I don't know what the timetable for that is. I don't know when he would be back, but it has been announced that Wunder is stepping into the top lane, stepping back into the top lane, if you will, to play this series at the very least against BDS, which is obviously incredibly intriguing. I have no idea what's going to happen in that series or how he's going to perform, but Wunder's a really good player, or at least he has been obviously one of the best top laners in the LEC basically every single time that he has played. I don't think this is going to be any sort of major downgrade so long as Wunder, is gelling with the rest of the team, I guess you could say. And so I'm still going to pick Fnatic even with the roster change, but I could see potentially something happening there. And then for G2 versus Mad, it's just almost impossible to go against G2 at the moment. I'm going to pick them. I think they're the better team. I think they'll be moving on to finals. I think they're the best team in the LEC, and I think that's been proven over and over again. Mad obviously has really good good, moments, and if they play the best that they can, which we know looks pretty darn good, then maybe they have an opportunity and a chance to be able to win a series like that. But I think G2 is just a team that you don't try to predict against. They're going to win unless something crazy comes up, and while Mad can pull out crazy, G2 are definitely favorites for a good reason. But would love to know what you guys' thoughts are in those two series down in the comment section below. Of course, let me know what you thought of the two series that we covered here today as well. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you are new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the LEC here, but we've posted about all 4 of the major regions all year long, and with the LEC being the last one to wrap up, Worlds is right around the corner. We're going to be doing some comprehensive Worlds previews and analysis and overviews when everything gets started, and so if you're interested in international coverage, especially from someone who has watched all 4 of the major regions, every single game of all 4 of the major regions all year long, this is the place for that. Hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.